This is yet another one of my confronting videos about self-accountability, because recognizing and owning the parts that we played in these dysfunctional dynamics is a very important step towards us regaining our freedom. So I hope you find the following insights clarifying in your situation. And this topic might be a bit too raw, and it may not be appropriate to confront if you are in the initial stages of healing. It's only appropriate to look at for those people who are at a stage of healing where they have already confronted the reality of being in an abusive relationship. So this video is all about identifying romanticized relationships. We need to look at ourselves and honestly ask ourselves, have I been wearing my colored glasses? Meaning, do I have an attachment to this romanticized idea of this person, or a fantasy relationship that does not actually exist? And this doesn't pertain to just romantic relationships. It also could pertain to relationships that we have with our family. I mean, we are so attached to the idea of how mummy and daddy should have raised us that we are so disappointed and so hurt and in so much pain because they did not meet those expectations. Unfortunately, they didn't. Whether they couldn't, perhaps our parent was on the spectrum of NPD, perhaps they did have a mental illness, perhaps they do have some sort of addiction, whatever the reason or combination of reasons. I think the most pain that we cause ourselves is when we're unwilling to accept a reality about a person that we love. And we believe that through our suffering that something is going to change. Instead of confronting the fact that yes, this person was our mother, our father, our husband, wife, sister, that was their role in our life. And yes, their behavior was extremely disappointing and it was completely inappropriate and it devastated our sense of the world and what we should expect from other human beings in future. But we cannot continue living with that expectation. It's like if we see a leopard and we see the spots, we know exactly that it's a dangerous cat. So why be in denial about the spots? Why expose ourselves to that leopard when we know they're most likely never going to change, because past behavior is a fairly good indicator of future behavior. And as we know, with narcissists, the whole pathology is based on pathological lying and deception and superiority. So chances are these people will never change. So the sooner that we accept that very harsh reality, that we never did have a loving relationship because they were simply unable for whatever reason, the sooner we can let that go and move on with our lives. I think not accepting a particular reality is what causes us so much unnecessary pain. It's easy to romanticize a person who's had a big impact on our life. For example, we might idealize our mother or our father and just emphasize all the great things and avoid even thinking about the severe neglect that we experienced. When we are romanticizing someone, we tend to over-exaggerate the good and downplay, minimize, or completely disregard the bad. It's this hyper-positive expression that feels very insincere. It almost sounds as if we're trying to convince ourselves. So we don't want to see things for how they are, but instead we cling on to how we want them to be. Many victims who are trauma bonded tend to idealize their abuser. Romanticizing can also apply to being in love with the idea of being in love. And when this occurs, it's when we feel like we're losing ourselves. It's also the type of relationships where we make a lot of excuses, where we justify, rationalize, and these are all forms of lying to ourselves because we have a preference for our fantasy or romantic idea of a person or a relationship. And unfortunately, sometimes we may get a reality check where we will be forced to have to separate the person or their role from the experience to be able to gain a clearer perspective. Please be aware that if you have a tendency to romanticize relationships, and what comes to mind is the concept of soulmates, or if you actually still believe that blood is thicker than water in reference to families, then a narcissist may intentionally manipulate that because they are very attuned to what strings they need to pull and when. So they may suddenly be able to become awkwardly affectionate or pay you a compliment that actually feels more like an insult, or offer you some breadcrumbs to foster our malignant state of hope. It's their attempt to feed our fantasy of who we want to believe they are. So know that narcissists will ruthlessly exploit this. And we really need to own that, because this is a big part of gaining psychological and emotional maturity. And I've said this many times before, not everybody is a candidate for a healthy relationship. We need to identify dysfunctional roles and abuse sooner and not confuse love and pity. And definitely never confuse attention with love. One of the main reasons why we can't accept a certain reality is because we are suffering from cognitive dissonance. And this is a very strategic method of how the narcissist ensures that we never leave. And it disables us from thinking clearly and making decisions rationally. It's when we tell ourselves stories that the abuser who verbally assaults you, who financially exploits you, who betrays you, deceives you, and sabotages your every inspiration, that they're not feeling well, or they've had a bad childhood, that they're not such a bad fill in the gaps for the role that you need them to fulfill. And when we hear ourselves saying that they need us, or that they're getting better, these are all ways in which we choose to cling onto fantasy, a romanticized role, an illusion of a relationship that does not exist. These are red flags of not wanting to confront reality. And the previous comments that I made, you'll usually hear being uttered by really lovely and kind-hearted souls who have no idea that they have been victimized. Narcissists will normalize abusive behavior, and we become hypnotized to believe that the erosion of our self-worth is absolutely fine. And so eventually you'll be walking around defending, justifying all the bullshit without even knowing that they've instilled within you a self-destruct program that supports their illusion and allows their abuse to continue. And this is why we need to be in touch with reality and really understand what constitutes loving and unloving behavior. The narcissist creates an illusion, and we are spellbound and hypnotized, and sometimes we don't even realize when we are participating in the creation and maintenance of this fantasy relationship. Our place, once we awaken to all of this, is to educate ourselves and exemplify setting higher standards in all our relationships, and not just romantic relationships, but in our friendships, in our workplace, and particularly with family. We unnecessarily continue to torture ourselves because we won't accept that a particular family member is not meeting our expectations. Let's remember that abusers don't come wearing a sign. They are often disguised as our family members, as our loved ones. So let's confront reality head on and accept situations for what they are sooner. I mean, how many times do we have to have been around the block to realize that all that sparkles isn't gold? If we're able to recognize that we have been romanticizing a relationship, it becomes imperative that we become absolutely certain with who is good for us and who is not good for us. We need to make decisions faster, because when we delay or we hesitate making those difficult decisions and we choose to cling on to a fantasy or a romanticized idea of who this person should be, we abandon ourselves. The really strange thing is that if you grew up in a dysfunctional family, you may harbor a great fear of abandonment. You may be so afraid of abandonment that you often cling on to this fantasy or to this relationship that you know deep down is hurting you. It becomes like existing in a malignant state of hope. And as we know, hope can be a great deceiver. Our fear of abandonment and of being alone can be so great that we would rather hold on. But what we don't realize is that we are the ones who abandon ourselves. Every time we tolerate abuse, being disregarded, being diminished, and being able to have the maturity to confront the fact that perhaps we have been in a fantasy relationship, we can then start to realize that this has actually been a really great lesson in discernment. And these kind of relationships will amplify your clarity. You will get to zero tolerance of any unloving, abusive behavior. And just to share from some of the experiences that I've had, some of the most painful and absolutely life-shattering realities that I was forced to confront that I didn't want to. The most difficult thing for me to confront was the fact that I had been living in denial, and that the denial that I chose to live in actually anesthetized me from the pain that I was really afraid of confronting. Another thing that I learnt the hard way is the fact that I allowed too much of things that I was actually very uncomfortable with. So developing courage seems to be a common theme in my life, and it goes on to this day. Relationships are our greatest opportunity to grow and to evolve if we choose to see it that way. And the perspective and the context, that is of utmost importance. And relationships that we have romanticized also become lessons in the importance of having discipline with our empathy. Because the cold hard truth is that you need to stop caring for people who hurt you and courageously confront the reality that this person who you falsely assumed was your parent, your spouse or sibling, or someone who filled the romanticized role of your Prince Charming, your savior, or your soulmate. They are illusionary roles that we either project onto these people, or they are roles that exploitative personalities choose to embody and masquerade in so they can continue to manipulate our lives. So psychologically and emotionally maturing means that we confront the fantasies, the romantic stories that we tell ourselves that preserve this illusion. If your goal is to liberate yourself from this and to become an authentic being, then notice if or when you're participating in this kind of magical thinking. Because these are the stories that we tell ourselves and the beliefs that we hold. And these are the dreams that have a tendency to quickly become our biggest nightmares.